guys, how's everyone doing this morning? I hope you're doing well. I am sleepy and need this coffee very, very badly. Oh, it's still piping hot, but it is fantastic to have a bit of coffee in the morning. Really does wake you up. Been making some wonderful progress with Blender and other bits and bobs and projects. It's been fun. It's been a lot of fun. So, there are going to be a lot more sort of personal projects and side things on the stream, just because. But I did actually want to natter a bit today about some things that have been going on. The first one I wanted to natter a bit about was an idea that I have seen floated in many different places, and had long conversations around with different people. I'm going to keep it pretty light, but it was mostly because someone was poking me about this, and I thought, it would be nice. It would be nice to go over the concept of it, just as a morning chat. I forgot that chat up there. Right. So the concept's quite simple. We have at the moment desktop VR, standalone VR, and wireless streaming. Those are like our bets. So desktop VR is basically the computer's doing all the work and it's sending an image down the wire, and then the headset's displaying the image. Now, many of the headsets and many of the systems use late stage reprojection technology to basically help like last minute sensor fusion. Actually, I probably should explain that, shouldn't I? So one of the challenges with VR is what we call sensor fusion. It's basically we have a buttload of sensors, whether they're laser sensors like Lighthouse, whether they're accelerometers. Most of these sensors sample at very, very high rates, and none of these sensors are very good on their own. And i.e., if you were just to take the raw data from these sensors, you wouldn't get a very good result, because they're quite noisy. A lot of these sensors are MEMS, microelectronic machinery. MEMS are notorious for having noise. So there is an entire field of computer science called sensor fusion, which is where you take data from a bunch of these different sensors and you fuse them together and you smooth the signals, and you come up with a good thing. And as I say, this kind of sensor fusion tends to not be done in the CPU or even the GPU because it's too fast and it's too specialized. So we tend to have dedicated hardware which does sensor fusion. With that, so like with your phone or whatever, if you're making an app on your phone which uses accelerometer data, or you're using sorry, I've got so many controllers, but they're all plugged in. So if you're using like a 6-axis controller, 6-axis controller, God, that's a throwback. If you're using a DS4 or a DualSense or whatever, the sensor data your game gets is relatively slow by sensor standards. It's usually like a polling system where you ask it and you get once every 60 frames, 100 frames, whatever it is, 60 hertz, 100 hertz, that's like 60 times every second. One time every 60 hertz frequency. Brain, wake up. Coffee needed. 60 hertz is 16 milliseconds. Yes, 60 times in a second. There we go. Brain gets there in the end. But many of these systems are running more than 200 hertz, sometimes as high as 1,000 hertz, and as I say, all being fused together. So one thing that the various headsets do in different ways is when they get that image is not just like an image sent to your monitor, it's got a bit more data in it, and there is late stage adjustment to that image, usually with onboard hardware, like in the actual headset. Or in the case of the PSVR, there's some of it that's done in the breakout box. But the reason to do that is because it's like very late stage adjustment, and it's very small adjustments, and it bends the image usually in small ways, but the adjustment is so small that the visual artifacts are usually small, as in like because you're stretching and smearing and doing things to the images. And some of the smarter systems even do things like layering and stuff, so you can do sensible adjustment. But that's kind of the state of PC VR. Now with standalone VR, a similar thing happens, but the standalone VR has the advantage of it's all happening on the same hardware. And while your game logic, like your Unity application or something like that, doesn't use the absolute latest data, the late binding of data is much easier. And obviously at the moment they're using Android, but Android has already some late binding stuff for its gyros and sensor stuff. So it already had some of that in there. But moving forward, we fully expect Facebook to develop their own operating system, both for business reasons and also just technical reasons. But I think they'll start off by just ripping apart parts of Android and doing optimizations there. So late stage binding and all that will get rather interesting. And I think standalone headsets will get a lot better at that. But there is a third category which we've not yet seen in development. We've seen theorized in a bunch of places, and we've seen talked about. But I'd like to talk a bit about it, and that is the HMD as GPU. Now, it's an interesting problem because we're in a world where, how do I say this? A high-end GPU costs more than a brand new next-gen console. Like, that is basically your computer's almost ended up to the point where we split the computer in half, where we've got your computer and then your GPU, and your GPU can put some people's computers to shame. In fact, hilariously, I have seen PC builds where the GPU is drawing more power than the rest of the PC combined, and the GPU can outperform the rest of the PC combined because people are putting a beefy GPU in a weaker PC. So, it's an interesting problem space to be in. But there is some discussion about, well, if instead of sending the image to the HMD, what if we were to send like the polygons, like the vertices and indices lists, and maybe some shader work, and then that was done on the GPU, and the HMD as the GPU. There's a few problems with this. It's not a terrible idea. In fact, there's some interesting applications for the idea. It depends of how you measure what, basically. So it's usually proposed as a concept because people want to run game code at say 30 frames, 60 frames, but they want like the VR headset to run at 90, 200 frames. 120, 90, 120, 200. Because 200 is very noticeable. Like if you try out, the difference between 60 and 90 is, I can never use a VR headset below 90 now. Now, at least not like, at least having the reprojection for 90. Thank you, Rag. It's always good to hear that. But yeah, 120. Oof, 120 feels good. 120 feels great. But then 200. I have tried 200 systems, and yeah, there's a noticeable improvement. So yeah, the thinking is, instead of sending images to the HMD, what if we were to send like not raw GPU data, but basically, what if we were to go slightly further up the GPU pipeline and we were to say put the rasterizer, i.e., the thing that turned the triangles and everything into pixels, in the headset. And we basically started turning the headset into more of a GPU system, or offloading some of the GPU's work to the headset. And it's an interesting challenge, because for those of you who don't know, a lot of animation systems, so it's not uncommon for an animation system to be running at a faster rate than your game logic. So Dreams is a perfect example. Dreams runs at 30 frames a second in its game thread, but its render thread runs as fast as it can. So that's not uncommon. And one of the reasons for this, so for example, you do weird things like, and I'm going to use Dreams again as an example because I know a lot of my audience knows Dreams, but this applies to a lot of games, and game engines. This applies to Unity and Unreal as well. So a lot of times, if you're moving something, like you're throwing something with your physics system, your physics system can update faster and whatever, and you can basically get like smooth interpolation of how a thing is moving, and you can basically, without updating the game logic, figure out, okay, last frame it was going this fast at this speed in this direction, let's just move it, nudge it along basically the same amount that it moved last frame, and assume that there's no acting input on it. And there's ways of integrating that with math. I don't want to go into calculus, but basically, if you know about integration and calculus, you can sort of figure that out. So we use a lot of tricks like that, where we get the graphics to run fast and then the game runs. So yeah, the thinking is, if instead of sending images to a VR headset, what if we were to send these earlier down the pipe? And it gets tricky, because one of the things we know is with GPUs, you've all seen about how important I/O is, right? So if you see like Mark Cerny talk about the PS5, and you see all these next gen things, you see about PCI Express's upgrades and whatnot, memory bandwidth to the GPU has become a big thing, because getting enough data to the GPU in time that it doesn't starve, like updating textures and stuff, can be really tricky. And it becomes a problem of, if you go up that pipeline at the wrong point, you could in theory be sending more data down the wire to the headset than just the image, right? The image could in theory be the smallest amount of data that you need to send. But as I say, it's not just about how much data bandwidth we have. It's about how latent is that data. So for example, let's say, I'm just going to invent some numbers. Let's say we had to send a gig of data, 120 frames, so per second. So 120 frames, we've got to send a gig of data. That means in a second we send 120 gigs. But if we could send, say, 2 gigs of data every 30 frames, then we're only sending 60 gigs a second, right? So you see the trade-off there. If we could send more data but update the headset less frequently, would that work? Now, obviously, this does mean that game developers and any VR developers would not be able to get their hands in as deep as they might potentially want to. But realistically, very few are. Very, very few game devs are getting that deep, like Call of Duty and a handful of others, like extreme AAA stuff. And the other advantage is if you're grabbing earlier in the GPU pipeline, you can do things like, well, first of all, there's less artifacts in that sensor fusion step, right? Because you have more math, basically. You know, rather than an image of a thing, you know the actual model of the thing. Inside the GPU headset, you can do more transformation to adjust for late stage sensor fusion stuff. But it also means that you can do things like, let's assume you've got eye tracking in there. Your eyes can jump about crazy fast. So we could do things for your eyes, for eye tracking, assuming that that's there. But then also for foveated rendering or for very focal distance stuff. So this is basically, at the moment, all VR headsets are a fixed focus plane, which means that it was one of the main reasons for eye strain in VR. Remember how I was talking about how I was getting eye strain? Because the screen is at a fixed distance and the lensing is designed as such to trick your brain into a relatively comfortable distance. I think it's usually about 1 meter to 2 meters focus distance, I forget, which is close to infinity. It's been too long since I've looked at lens configurations to actually know what their headsets are currently using. But that's one of the biggest problems we have, because in reality, when we look at things in the real world, our focus is constantly adjusting, and it's one of the ways that our eyes and our brains build up a sense of depth is we just sort of wobble our focus in our eyeballs, and we sort of see what that does to the image, and our brain infers depth information from that. And some people use that technique a lot more than others, and those people experience more discomfort in VR currently. But it turns out that doing that kind of transformation in I tell you. Doing that kind of transformation in late stage reprojection, if you only have an image, could be very, very difficult. It could be quite tough to do that kind of transformation late stage. Yeah. Whereas if we have the GPU information, we could, in theory, do it. But of course, so those are all the reasons you'd want to do it. Why are the reasons you don't want to do it? We've talked about the memory issue, the memory reason. It does also mean you need to move closer to a standalone headset, as in now you need to put a bunch of video graphics memory on your headset, which you've not had to do before. And we know video graphics memory is way bigger, and it's constantly getting bigger, and the expectations for it to get bigger. I have heard some proposals on why we wouldn't move the whole GPU to the headset. We'd move part of the GPU to the headset, and if we're moving part of the GPU to the headset, we potentially wouldn't need as much graphics memory. But we're talking a decent chunk of memory, and it's usually GDDR6 in the new GPUs, which is expensive memory, very expensive. Probably push up the price of the headsets. But then on top of that, the power consumption of GPUs is pretty intense. So power consumption is an interesting discussion because if we look at some different cables, so this is going to be a pain in the neck. Okay, The PSVR cable is about 2 fingers. Maybe it's a bit of a thinner 2 fingers split. And the index cable is about my pinky. Now, the original index cable was a lot thicker, but they've done some decent engineering to get it down. And then the Oculus Link cable can be as thin as a USB-C cable. A lot of that's to do with power delivery. Basically, the thickness of the cable is about how much shielding it needs to go through, as in like how much data you're sending through and how sensitive the data is. But it's mostly to do about with how hot can that cable get. How hot can that cable get? What are your thermals? What's safe? And there is some pretty stringent regulation about that. Because in lab conditions, the amount of stuff you can send down a cable, perfect non-bent cable without thermals, is very high. Without thermal runaway, i.e. cable melting, it's very high. But in reality, the cable gets bent a bunch. The cable gets bent, kinked. People step on the cable. A whole bunch of things happen to the cable, so we have to build in consumer tolerance for the cables. That's another point, comrade, that I didn't actually mention earlier, is with images we have some pretty well established image compression technology, which really helps us. On top of that, we have some pretty good pre-built silicon for image decoding. That's another reason why we've largely stuck to sending images along the wire. This is a case of alternate history problem. There is a lot of good papers and there is a lot of good thinking around data compression of different domain space data and vertice data and stuff. Basically what I'm saying is we're good at compressing and squishing images because we've had to do it a lot and we've thought about it a lot. We have not thought about squishing model data as much. There has been some thinking on it, but the software and the science and the math behind model data compression is pretty minimal at this point. It's a lot better than it used to be, but for instance, the amount of SIGGRAPH papers and things you see about it was pretty on the low end. Having said that, recent advancements in LiDAR, so this is for self-driving cars, for photo scanning, for volumetric data and stuff, there have been some good papers coming out about compressing that kind of data down. And we have been getting better at that, and I expect us to get better at that. So there's that. But yeah, essentially, the more electronics we put into the headset, the more the power drain, the more we have to push power through to the device, which means the cable gets thicker. Now, one of the beauties of taking a standalone headset and basically putting a standalone headset into PC mode is that standalone headset has all the components you need. But better than that, and it's one of the things that makes the headset heavy, it's one of the things that makes the headset more expensive and troublesome, is batteries. Because GPU demand is not constant. So if a device has an onboard battery, then you can smooth out the returns on that battery. And that's very handy. That's very, very handy. That reduces the amount of power you need to push through to the device. Now, it does mean in long-term usage, you could get yourself into a situation where you've got a trickle charge situation where the device is running down and you're not charging it fast enough. But it's one of those things. What about the law of exponential returns in terms of component and cable size? There's no hard physical laws here that are hitting us. There are, but it's not like we're fighting the inverse cube law. So I mean, I gave a talk years ago about why Moore's law is complete bullshit, and it's been largely dead. Having said that, recently we've seen a lot of silicon advancements, but if you chart the density of silicon, Moore's law's pretty much been dead since, on the CPU side, since 2002-ish, 2004-ish. It's been a long time, and we're until we change materials, because we're still using silicon. There's some theories about changing materials, like what we change materials in, but how we're currently solving the problem. You'll hear about chipsets, you'll hear about nanometer size. So this is how, basically it's how thick the wires inside the chip are. And we've been shrinking those down. But how we've mostly been doing the advancements in the last 20 odd years is we moved from two-dimensional layers to stacked 2D layers, and then more recently we've worked true three-dimensional mapping inside of chips. So complex that most humans can't lay out chips anymore. They can debug them and stuff, but there's actually a lot of machine stuff. And chip design is so far down that rabbit hole at this point that there are engineering tricks to basically so if you ever deal with water, so my brother's a civil engineer and deals with plumbing a lot, designing breweries and things. And if you ever had to deal with the problems of water flowing through pipes, and basically water has weight, and when it hits the edge of a pipe, it's like dunk and shakes the pipe, and there's all kinds of compression waves and really nasty physics you have to deal with. There is the equivalent of that for electrons. Electrons will literally burst pipes in the chip. They will quantum tunnel, and they will jump across. They'll jump across wires and stuff. And so we will literally build these little like U-bends in chips, like basically the same thing your toilet or your sink has for that kind of stuff. We will build that inside circuitry to basically control the flow of electrons, to stop them spilling over inside your hardware. Like people think like computers are digital, and they always want to think about ones and zeros. But computers are inherently analog, and we work at the digital level to simplify the problem. We work at the digital level to go, oh no, we don't want to think about square wave functions and things like that. So anyway, that's a thing. To get back to the original point, are there any physical laws that we're fighting with headsets and moving GPUs into headsets and stuff? As I say, you will have noticed GPU cards have got bigger. That's because if you're fighting your competition and you're fighting physics and you're trying to get things better, making things slightly bigger is an acceptable situation, because there's no design pressure on GPU size. I mean, there is some design pressure on GPU size, but like smartphones have consistently gotten smaller, and the reason is because people want smartphones to consistently get smaller or thinner or whatever. But that's not the direction science wants us to go. Science wants us for phones to get fatter. And this is also why phones have somewhat plateaued lately, and it's why you'll see phones get slightly taller or things, because engineers want space. There has not been that space pressure as much on GPUs, which is why you'll get like the newest AMD or NVIDIA cards, and there will be these beefy monstrosities. So it's where the engineering pressure is. Now, contrary to popular belief, weight is a concern in HMDs. Not as much a concern for comfort as some people think. Good product design can... So I remember when Vive, Rift, and PSVR came out. PSVR was the heaviest headset at the time. Everyone agreed it was the most comfortable, because in terms of product design, Sony just blew the others out of the water in terms of experience. And now we see better strap design and back buckle design and stuff. And I'm convinced when they were developing the Quest that the version of the Quest everyone internally was using and the version of the Quest they thought they would ship would be the Quest with the Elite battery strap. And that it was only late stage product development and pricing discussion that moved the battery strap into an optional accessory. Because the battery strap just makes so much sense to weight distribute and to push the battery back down here. It just makes sense. It just makes sense. But it was smart of them to be able to do the cost strip. But yeah, with if the battery strap wasn't optional, as in if it was part of the base offering, they potentially could have moved some more circuitry back there and done some thermal spread back there, which would have helped them in other ways. But, these are the trade-offs you make. So I think it's entirely feasible that we could see a version of the headset that is halfway between standalone and PC from an engineering point of view. From a consumer point of view, I don't see it happening. Just because of where the OVR spec is, where desktop VR is, it's much more likely that the standalone headsets will basically do the stuff we're talking about, with more intermediate data being sent to the headset from, say, a PC. But yeah, I just it's a really interesting problem to noodle, and I wish we had. So one company that could, in theory, do it is Apple. Apple, they're not going to. It's too big a risk, and Apple, it's too big a risk. People get very upset when you change architectures. I mean, I think the best example of that is the PS3. The PS3 was beautiful system. I still, ironically, the PS3 and SPU design, the way that the whole cell architecture worked, is a lot closer to where graphics cards ended up with compute units. Compute units are hilariously similar to SPUs. There's some important differences about memory access and about being able to adjust your wavefront sizes and things like that. But ultimately, the PS3 design was the correct decision long term. But there's a reason why we're still sticking around with x86. And like the shift to x64 just was painful for people. I remember the shift to the PS4 generation, basically the thing that everyone talked about was moving your math from 32 to 64 bits, because you just underestimate how lazy people are. The amount of stuff where people had this maths code that they had pulled from like the Quake engine, or they had pulled from some similarly old source code, and it had been passed from programmer to programmer to programmer, and none of the fuckers understood the math because they're all lazy. And so they didn't understand why this magic number with this magic number did this thing, but that only works in 32 bytes and with certain overflow qualities. And so when the math moved to 64 bits, it all broke, and it upset a lot of people. Like, that's actually one of the main reasons why you see so many programs battle to move from 32 to 64, is all the bit hackery that went on that a lot of programmers didn't understand, which was funny. But then there's also just like, trade-offs everywhere in terms of how do you figure out your memory layouts, and how do you redo all your offsets and your packing and stuff. And it's actually kind of funny because we talk about our systems being 64-bit, but most modern architectures actually have 128-bit instructions as well. They're just few and far between, and we only use them for some things. So we actually have 128-bit systems, most of us, to play with, but in limited capacities. And then you get like half-width 32-bit instructions and things like that. Anyway, I'm going into the weeds. Holy fuck, has this been a technical morning. I woke up and it was just like, I want to talk about VR headsets as GPUs and what the split is. I decided to get my super techie hat on, and I don't know why. But anyway, there it is. My morning coffee was a rant about VR headsets as GPUs. My conclusion for you all is it's an interesting idea, but industry inertia and the value offer is just, it's unlikely to happen. The people who would most likely to be doing it is Apple or a console developer, because if you're developing a headset to work with console, you can slice it however you want to slice it because it's vertical. Apple, with their custom silicon and with their full ownership of the Mac system, could potentially do something there. PlayStation 5 does support the PSVR in backwards compat mode. The official statement, you would have to go dig the official wording out because I don't want to mess it up. But there's an official statement from Jim Ryan about the future of VR. Yes, there is that thing out there. I don't want to mess up what was said. But yes, it's backwards compat. I don't want to mess up what he said, Emberg, so I'm not gonna comment on that. But yeah, so that's kind of where the state of that is. It's not to be clear, Sony. You forget Sony's bread and butter is image sensors, lidars, display technology. Sony makes TVs and displays and cameras and all this stuff. Like, Sony corporate is extremely invested in the virtual reality space, and many of its products are used in various headsets at a very low level. The commentary I was speaking about was PlayStation specific, and that's why I say Jim Ryan and not someone from Sony Corp. But yeah, there is an expression. There is an expression there. That being said, the camera adapter exists, backwards compat exists, and if a developer has built their game like Dreams is built to uncap itself based on how much power is available to it, then the game can scale onto PS5 hardware. That's the thing that all happens. So, we are getting a boost and a bump. It's there. If you've played PSVR if you've played Dreams PSVR on PS5, you'll notice a huge improvement. I know, check it out, Embergers, check it out. Backwards compat does come with some caveats. Make sure you're using your old peripherals. If you've got the HD camera plugged in, the HD camera and the old camera do not play nice with each other when they're both plugged in. You might get some weirdness on that, so just unplug the new camera. I fully admit it's jank. It is jank, but that is there. But yeah, I think we should probably look at wrapping up. That's the thing. That's the thing I wanted to talk about. With if you're going to be able to buy a VR headset that's partly your desktop GPU, and if we're going to get those halfway house headsets. And as I say, my conclusion is I don't think so. It is possible for Apple or a console developer, someone who has strong vertical integration, do it. There's a lot of engineering inertia that would stop it, likely. But the techniques that we've discussed could definitely be used in a standalone headset like the Quest. Or if anyone else develops a standalone headset, those techniques can be used to change. I'm lost. What does that mean? Well, the VOD will be there. You can go back and watch it, Fragile. We went and explained through all of it. We just had about an hour conversation about headset design and GPU split stuff. No worries. These are my morning chats. They're not always just chats like this. Sometimes we play a bit of a game or something, but let's be honest. 90% this is me nattering into a camera about something that's got my interest. That's 90% what that is. This is so freaking lame. I was drinking wine last night and I needed some water. I was like, got my water bottle there and I was like, screw it, water. Wine to water. That being said, darlings, I will see you all tomorrow. We'll have another natter about something. And until then, take care and I'll see you when I see you.
Rock it like you so.